The fluorescent lights above Aaliyah's hospital bed hummed in a way that made her teeth ache. She gripped the edge of the mattress, the paper gown crinkling as another wave of pain rolled through her stomach. She was sure she had misheard him. "I want a divorce." Minyi stood near the door, not beside her, not holding her hand, near the door like a man already halfway gone. "Aaliyah, I want a divorce." He said it again, quieter this time, almost gentle, which was somehow worse. "I should have said it a long time ago." The door swung open hard. Dr. Mitchell stopped short, a manila folder pressed tight to her chest, her eyes moving fast between the two of them. She read the room in 1 second flat. "I'm sorry, I can come back." "No," Aaliyah's voice came out rough. "Say what you came to say." The doctor hesitated. She glanced at Minyi, then back at Aaliyah. Something moved across her face, not quite pity, worse than pity. "Mrs. Park." Dr. Mitchell set the folder on the counter beside the sink. She took a breath. "I have your results." Minyi stepped forward for the first time. "Is it serious? Whatever it is, just tell us. She's been in pain for 3 weeks. Dr. Mitchell shook her head slowly. "It isn't an illness." The air in the room changed. Aaliyah felt her chest loosen by a fraction, but Minyi's words were still sitting on her like a stone. Divorce. He had asked her for a divorce in a hospital room. Then what is it? She whispered, "Mrs. Park." The doctor's voice was careful. "You're pregnant, approximately 11 weeks. The room went completely still. Aaliyah's hand moved to her stomach before she even told it to. 11 weeks, nearly 3 months. The nausea she had written off as stress. The exhaustion she had blamed on working double shifts to cover what his failing business couldn't. The dizziness she had quietly endured alone because she didn't want to be a burden. She had assumed the worst. They both had, but not this. She turned to look at Minyi. He had gone pale. His arms hung at his sides. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto ice and felt it crack. That's not," he started. 11 weeks, Aaliyah said. Her voice was hollow. "That was your birthday." He went still. "The hotel, after your mother's dinner, when you told me things were going to get better." Minyi's mouth opened, closed. His jaw worked like he was searching for language and coming up empty. "Congratulations," Dr. Mitchell said softly. Her tone made it clear she understood exactly what she had walked into. "I'll give you 2 a moment. The nurse will bring prenatal paperwork when you're ready." She slipped out. The door clicked shut. Aaliyah didn't move. She stared at the man she had married 4 years ago, the man who had cried at their wedding, the man whose debts she had paid and whose dreams she had funded and whose family's cruelty she had swallowed quietly for years, the man who had just asked her for a divorce. Minyi. He wouldn't look at her. "Minyi, look at me." Nothing. "You were going to leave me." Her voice came out steady, dangerously steady. "You sat in this room watching me bent over in pain, not knowing what was wrong with me, and you asked me for a divorce. Aaliyah, you don't. She slid off the examination table. Her legs shook, but they held. "You don't get to tell me what I don't understand. You looked at me at my worst and you chose that moment. That is what I need you to help me understand." He finally met her eyes. And for the first time since she had known him, Minyi Park had absolutely nothing to say. If you're watching this and already hooked, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Comment below the time and where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story reaches. The fluorescent lights of the clinic hummed with a clinical indifference that felt at odds with the roaring silence in the room. Dr. Mitchell didn't look up immediately. He kept his gaze fixed on the tablet in his hand, his thumb scrolling through a series of monochrome images that looked, to Aaliyah, like nothing more than static and shadows. She shifted on the crinkling butcher paper of the exam table, the sound unnervingly loud. Her hands were cold, tucked firmly under her thighs to keep them from shaking. For 3 weeks, she had braced herself for the worst. She had researched autoimmune flares, chronic fatigue, and rare tropical parasites, anything that might explain why her body felt like it was being hollowed out from the inside. "The blood work is back, Aaliyah," Dr. Mitchell said finally. He set the tablet down and leaned back, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Along with the ultrasound we just finished." "Is it my thyroid again?" she asked, her voice thin. "I've been so exhausted I can barely keep my head up at my desk. And the nausea, I thought it was the new medication, but it isn't stopping." The doctor softened then, the sharp professional edge of his posture giving way to something more human. He offered a small, knowing smile that made Alina's heart perform a frantic staccato against her ribs. "It's not an illness, Alina, and your thyroid is actually behaving quite well, all things considered." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "The reason you're exhausted is that your body is working overtime. You're approximately 11 weeks pregnant." The world didn't tilt, it simply stopped. Alina stared at a small poster on the far wall detailing the anatomy of the inner ear, her mind refusing to process the words. 11 weeks, that was. Nearly 3 months. 3 months of missed drinks at happy hour blamed on stomach bugs. 3 months of blamming her tight waistlines on stress eating. 3 months of a life she thought was heading in one direction suddenly veering off a cliff. "Pregnant," she whispered. The word felt foreign, a jagged stone in her mouth. That's not possible. We were careful. The doctors said after the surgery years ago that the chances were nearly zero." "Nearly zero is never zero," Mitchell replied gently. He turned the screen toward her. This time he pointed to a specific shape amidst the gray static. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a curve, a distinct silhouette with a flickering pulse at its center, a rhythmic, frantic little light that proved her entire reality had shifted in the span of a heartbeat. "That's the cardiac activity. Everything looks remarkably healthy. Strong, actually." Alina reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the glass screen. She felt a strange, terrifying warmth bloom in her chest, warring violently with the cold panic in her stomach. 11 weeks. She thought of the coffee she'd gulped down this morning, the frantic pace of her promotion cycle, and the man waiting for her at home who had long ago accepted a future that was just the two of them. The doctor remained silent, giving her the space to breathe, though the air in the room felt suddenly too thick to swallow. The secret was out, no longer a mystery of the body but a blooming reality of life. Her hands, finally freed from beneath her legs, came up to rest tentatively over her still flat stomach. 11 weeks, she repeated, the shock finally beginning to melt into a fragile, terrifying wonder. The sound of the zipper catching on a stray thread was the loudest thing in the apartment. Aaliyah didn't swear. She didn't even sigh. She simply pinched the fabric, eased the metal teeth back, and pulled again with a slow, deliberate finality. The suitcase lay on the bed like a heavy lung, filled with the breathing room she had been denied for 3 years. She had always thought leaving would be a cinematic explosion, shouted accusations, shattered glass, a door slammed so hard the frames on the wall would tilt. Instead, it was quiet. It was the sound of a toothbrush clicking into a plastic case, and the soft thud of sweaters being folded into neat, defiant squares. The apartment was beautiful, a curated gallery of their shared life, but as she moved through the rooms, she realized how little of her was actually there. The mid-century modern coffee table was his choice. The minimalist prints on the walls were his aesthetic. Even the scent in the air, sandalwood and expensive espresso, was a fragrance he had picked out because it felt sophisticated. She had spent 36 months tucking her edges in, trimming her vibrant colors down to a palatable beige just to fit into the corners he left empty for her. She reached into the back of the closet and pulled out her second bag, a battered duffel she'd kept from her college days. It was a stark contrast to the leather luggage he'd bought her for their anniversary, the one she was leaving behind on the top shelf. She didn't want his gifts. Gifts were just anchors, and she was finally cutting the rope. As she folded a silk scarf, her hand brushed against a framed photo on the dresser. In it, they were laughing at a gala, his arm draped over her shoulder in a way that looked like affection but, in hindsight, felt like a claim. She had been his favorite accessory, the brilliant woman who made him look grounded, the partner who was always available but never quite central. She was tired of being the person he called when the world was too much, only to be shelved the moment his own ambitions took center stage again. She wasn't a supporting character in his biography. She wasn't an afterthought to be penciled into the margins of a busy Saturday. The weight of the realization was heavy, but it wasn't burdensome. It felt like gravity finally working the way it was supposed to. Aaliyah zipped the second bag and stood in the center of the bedroom. The silence was no longer heavy. It was clean. She took one last look around. There was a hollow ache in her chest, the kind that comes from mourning a version of the future that was never actually going to happen. Beneath that was a steady, rhythmic pulse of relief. She walked to the entryway, set her keys on the console table, right next to the bowl of lemons he insisted stay full for visual balance, and picked up her bags. The weight of the 2 suitcases pulled at her shoulders, a physical reminder of everything she was taking back. Her time, her space, herself. She didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to explain that hadn't been said in a dozen ignored conversations and 100 lonely evenings. Aaliyah stepped out into the hallway, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her with a soft, decisive thud. For the first time in years, she wasn't wondering where she fit in. She was just going. The rain began as a rhythmic drumming against the window of Aaliyah's new, sparse apartment, a stark contrast to the suffocating luxury she had left behind. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by the 2 bags that now held her entire life, when her phone buzzed. It wasn't a call from Minyi. She had already blocked his number, refusing to hear the rehearsed apologies he surely had prepared, but an encrypted message from an unknown contact. "I know why you left," the message read, "and I know what his mother did to make sure you would." Aaliyah's breath hitched. For months, a cold intuition had been gnawing at her, a sense that the sudden friction between her and Minyi hadn't been accidental. His mother, a woman who wore her elegance like a suit of armor, had always looked at Aaliyah as if she were a smudge on a pristine glass surface. But Aaliyah had never been able to prove that the misunderstandings and the leaked rumors were anything more than the byproduct of a powerful woman's disdain. The phone buzzed again, followed by an address for a quiet tea house on the edge of the city. "My name is Hannah. I used to be where you are now." An hour later, Aaliyah sat across from a woman who looked like a ghost of a life she had narrowly escaped. Hannah was polished, but there was a weariness in her eyes that no amount of expensive concealer could mask. She held her teacup with trembling fingers, her gaze darting toward the door as if expecting Minyi's mother to materialize from the shadows. "She paid me," Hannah began, her voice barely a whisper. 3 years ago, I was the one she used to drive a wedge between Minyi and his previous partner. When that worked, she kept me on a retainer. I was her shadow woman, the one who whispered in the right ears, the one who ensured the social circles Minyi moved in felt just a little too small for someone like you." Aaliyah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp evening. "Why tell me this now? You're still on her payroll." "Because I watched what she did to you," Hannah said, finally meeting Aaliyah's eyes. "The way she manipulated the gallery opening, the way she made sure those investors pulled out of your project. It wasn't just about protecting her son's reputation. She wants to break you so completely that you'll never consider coming back. She thinks if she destroys your world, you'll blame Minyi and he'll blame you." The betrayal tasted like copper in Aaliyah's mouth. It wasn't just that his mother was a monster. It was the realization that the bad luck that had plagued Aaliyah's career for the last 6 months had been a calculated execution. "She has a file," Hannah continued, sliding a small, nondescript USB drive across the table. "Every contact she sabotaged, every lie she fed to Minyi about your infidelity and your ambition. He doesn't know the half of it, Aaliyah. He thinks you left because you stopped loving him. He has no idea his mother was the one holding the knife." Aaliyah stared at the silver drive. It was the key to a truth that could burn Minyi's world to the ground. But as she looked at Hannah, a woman who had spent years as a pawn in someone else's game, Aaliyah realized she didn't want to use it to win him back. She wanted to use it to ensure his mother never had a pawn again. "Why give this to me?" Aaliyah asked. Hannah stood up, wrapping her coat tightly around her thin frame. "Because I'm tired of living in the shadows. And because you're the first one who actually had the courage to pack your bags and walk away before she could finish you." The drive felt heavy in Aaliyah's pocket, a small piece of cold metal that seemed to pulse against her hip as she climbed the stairs back to her sanctuary. Once inside, the low light of her laptop screen was the only thing illuminating the room. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the port. To open this was to finally shatter the last remaining illusion of the life she had lived, the belief that Minyi's failures over the past year had been a result of his own fatting drive. When the files finally loaded, they didn't contain letters or whispered recordings. They were spreadsheets, cold, clinical rows of numbers that told a story more brutal than any verbal confession. Aaliyah scrolled through the PDF statements of Minyi's primary business accounts. At first glance, they looked like standard overhead, marketing fees, consultant retainers, legal payouts. But as she cross-referenced the names of the shell companies with the notes Hana had provided, the pattern emerged with sickening clarity. Every time Minyi had come home spiraling, clutching his head and wondering why the venture capital had stalled or why the payroll taxes were suddenly insurmountable, a management fee had been diverted. His mother hadn't just been poisoning his reputation, she had been bleeding him dry. Aaliyah leaned back, the blue light of the screen reflecting in her wide eyes. She remembered the night in February when Minyi had sat on the edge of their bed, his face gray with exhaustion, telling her he might have to sell his share of the firm. He had felt like a failure, a man who couldn't live up to the suffocating legacy of his name. And all the while, the woman who claimed to be his fiercest protector was systematically siphoning his liquid assets into offshore holdings he couldn't touch. The paperwork showed a transfer of nearly $500,000 just 2 days before Aaliyah had packed her bags. It was categorized as a family trust reinvestment, but the destination was a private account controlled solely by his mother. She wasn't just making him fail. She was orchestrating his bankruptcy to ensure he had nowhere to turn but home. She wanted him broken, penniless, and back under her thumb, stripped of the independence Aaliyah had always encouraged him to find. Aaliyah felt a wave of nausea. She had left because she felt like an afterthought, but looking at these ledgers, she realized Minyi was a prisoner who didn't even know he was in a cage. The freedom they had tried to build together had been an elaborate stage play, with his mother pulling the strings of the very floor they stood on. She looked at the digital trail of betrayal, the timestamps of the transfers often coinciding with the very moments Minyi was at his most vulnerable. It was a masterpiece of domestic sabotage. If he saw this, it wouldn't just break his heart, it would dismantle his entire sense of reality. He still believed his mother was his safety net. He had no idea she was the one who had cut the tightrope. Aaliyah's fingers moved to the print command. The quiet whir of the small inkjet printer she'd bought that afternoon began to fill the room, the pages sliding out one by one. She didn't know yet if she would give them to him, but she knew she couldn't let the paper trail disappear into the digital void. This wasn't just about his money anymore. It was about the fact that even in her absence, the cruelty of that family continued to consume everything it touched. She gathered the warm pages, her jaw tightening. The 2 bags in the corner were no longer the only things she was carrying. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up, his voice sounding hollowed out. As if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. Aaliyah didn't wait for a greeting. She didn't offer the comfort he clearly expected. She simply gave him a time and a place, a public park, neutral ground where the shadows were long and the air was too cold for sentimentality. When Minyi arrived, he looked frayed. His coat was unbuttoned, and the sharp, confident line of his jaw had softened into something weary and defeated. He reached out as if to touch her arm, but Aaliyah stepped back, the movement sharp and instinctive. She wasn't there for a reconciliation, she was there for an awakening. She led him to a stone bench and sat, pulling the stack of printed documents from her bag. The paper was crisp, the ink dark and unforgiving. Without a word, she handed him the first sheet, the ledger of the shell companies. "What is this, Aaliyah?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he scanned the rows. "I told you the business is failing." The market shifted, and the investors. "The market didn't shift, Minyi," she interrupted, her voice steady and quiet. "Your mother did." She watched his face as he realized what he was looking at. She pointed to the dates, the specific transfers that aligned with his most desperate moments. She showed him the family trust reinvestments that were actually black holes for his capital. As he flipped through the pages, the confusion in his eyes was replaced by a slow, agonizing dawning of the truth. He saw the withdrawal made the night he had wept in her arms about the payroll taxes. He saw the legal fees paid to a firm that had been hired not to defend him, but to ensure his contracts remained unenforceable. She wouldn't, he whispered, the paper trembling in his hand. "She's been the only one trying to help me bail out the ship." "She was the one drilling the holes, Minyi," Aaliyah said. She reached into her bag and pulled out the final piece, the logs Hannah had provided. "She didn't just take your money. She took your reputation. She made sure you felt like a failure so you would crawl back to the only person who would still accept you. She wanted you small. She wanted you dependent." Minyi sat back, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged shudder. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with the ghosts of the arguments they'd had, the times she had tried to tell him something felt wrong, and the times he had defended his mother's protection. He looked at the evidence of his own mother's betrayal, and for the first time the blinders didn't just slip, they shattered. The man who had always been so meticulously composed looked suddenly like a stranger to himself. He looked at the wealth he thought he was building and realized it had been a mirage managed by a ghostwriter. More importantly, he looked at Aaliyah, not as the woman who had abandoned him, but as the only person who had stayed long enough to see the knife in his back. "I didn't know," he choked out, his eyes red-rimmed. "Aaliyah, I swear." "I know you didn't," she said, rising from the bench. She felt a strange, detached pity for him, but the relief of being outside of that blast radius was stronger. "But now you do. You can't unsee this, Minyi. You can go back to her and pretend none of this exists, or you can finally become the man you kept telling me you were." She didn't wait for his answer. She walked away, leaving him on the bench with the paper trail of his ruined life scattered between his feet, the wind beginning to catch the edges of the pages. The park was nearly empty, the wind whipping the edges of the printed bank statements until they sounded like 1,000 tiny wings beating against the cold air. Minyi sat frozen, his fingers numbing as they gripped the ink-stained proof of his mother's betrayal. For the first time in his life, the silence wasn't a comfort. It was a mirror. He saw himself clearly, the man who had let his partner shoulder the weight of his failures, while he defended the very person who was sabotaging them. He looked at the path Aaliyah had taken, her silhouette disappearing into the gray evening. The realization hit him with a physical force that made his lungs ache. He hadn't just been losing his business or his money. He had been systematically stripped of the only person who actually saw him. He had been a coward, hiding behind the safety of a family legacy that was actually a noose, and in doing so, he had almost let the most real thing in his life slip through his fingers. He stood up, his legs unsteady. He didn't go to his car. He didn't call his mother to demand an explanation. That would come later once he could trust himself not to shatter. Instead, he began to run. He followed the direction she had gone, his heart hammering against his ribs with a frantic, desperate rhythm. He found her at the corner, waiting for a light to change. She didn't turn when she heard his heavy breathing, but her shoulders went rigid. "Aaliyah," he gasped, the word coming out as a plea. She turned slowly, her expression guarded, her eyes searching his face for the old shadows of denial. She didn't find them. What she saw was a man who looked like he had finally woken up in the middle of a wreckage. "I've been a fool," he said, the words tumbling out, raw and unpolished. "I spent so long trying to prove I was worthy of a name that was designed to keep me small. I let her make me doubt you. I let her make me doubt us." He stepped closer but stopped just short of the distance she had established between them. He didn't deserve to bridge it yet. "I don't expect you to come back," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I wouldn't come back to the person I've been, but please don't let her win this. Don't let her be the reason we end." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. "I'm cutting it all off. The accounts, the trust, the firm. I'm walking away from everything she touched. I'd rather have nothing and be a man you can respect than have her version of success and be a ghost." Aaliyah watched him, her gaze flickering over the desperation in his eyes. The light changed, but neither of them moved. "I'm not asking for things to go back to how they were," Minyi continued, a single tear tracing a path through the exhaustion on his face. "That life was a lie. I'm begging for a second chance to build something real, just a chance to show you I'm finally awake." The silence stretched between them, no longer heavy with secrets but vibrating with the terrifying possibility of a new beginning. Aaliyah didn't reach for his hand, but she didn't walk away either. She looked at the man standing before her, broken, stripped of his pride, and finally, for the first time, truly honest. "I can't give you a second chance, Minyi," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I can give you a conversation, tomorrow, at my apartment. Don't bring your mother's name, and don't bring your excuses." She turned and stepped into the crosswalk, leaving him standing under the flickering street lamp. It wasn't a yes, but as Minyi watched her go, he felt the first spark of heat in a world that had been frozen for far too long. The lobby of the Grand Imperial smelled of white lilies and expensive silence, a fragrance that had once represented security to Minyi, but now felt like the scent of a mausoleum. He didn't wait for the concierge to announce him. He bypassed the velvet ropes and ascended to the penthouse suite, his reflection in the gold-trimmed elevator mirrors looking like a man he barely recognized, haggard, sharp-eyed, and finally, dangerously calm. When the heavy oak doors opened, his mother was seated by the floor-to-ceiling window, a crystal glass of sparkling water in her hand. She didn't look surprised. She looked at him with the practiced poise of a grandmaster who had already anticipated his move. "You look terrible, Minyi," she said, her voice like silk over a blade. "I assume Aaliyah has been filling your head with her usual theatrics. I told you she was unstable." Minyi didn't sit. He walked to the center of the room and dropped the stack of printed bank statements onto the marble coffee table. The sound was a dull thud that seemed to echo in the cavernous space. "Theatrics don't usually come with routing numbers and timestamps, Mother," he said. His voice was low, devoid of the frantic energy that usually defined their arguments. "I saw the transfers. I saw the shell companies. I even saw the payments to the shadow woman you hired to ensure my contracts failed." His mother didn't flinch. She set her glass down with a precise click and leaned back, her expression shifting from feigned concern to a cold, analytical disappointment. "I was protecting the legacy. You were throwing your life away on a girl who had no respect for the weight of your name. You were failing, Minyi. I simply ensured that when you hit bottom, the only safety net left was me." "You didn't protect me," Minyi replied, stepping closer until the shadow of his frame fell across her lap. "You preyed on me. You watched me break night after night, wondering why I wasn't enough, while you were the one holding the hammer. You would rather see me bankrupt and broken at your feet than successful and standing on my own. You are nothing without this family," she snapped, the first crack appearing in her porcelain mask. "Without my capital, without my connections, you are just another man struggling to pay rent. Is that what you want? A life of mediocrity with a woman who will leave the moment the money truly runs out?" Minyi felt a strange, cold laugh bubble in his chest. "Aaliyah left when the money was still there, because she couldn't stand the person I was becoming under your thumb. She's the only real thing I've ever had, and you tried to burn her to the ground just to keep me in your dollhouse." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys, the keys to the firm, the keys to the estate car, and the private secondary card she had given him years ago. He set them next to the evidence of her betrayal. "I'm done being your puppet," he said. "I've already filed the paperwork to dissolve my association with the trust. I'm liquidating what's left of my personal shares and walking away. Keep the legacy. Keep the safety net. I'd rather be a man with nothing than a ghost in your gallery." "You'll be back," she said, her voice trembling with a suppressed rage. "By next month, when the bills come due and your pride starts to taste like ash, you'll be knocking on this door." Minyi looked at her one last time, not with anger but with a profound, soul-deep pity. "The only reason I'll ever knock on a door again is if I'm the one who built the house. Don't call me. Don't look for me. As far as the world is concerned, your son died the moment he saw those ledgers." He turned and walked out, the silence of the penthouse closing in behind him. As the elevator descended, he felt the suffocating weight of the name Minyi falling away, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful lightness. The smell of sawdust and fresh cedar had replaced the sterile scent of sandalwood that used to define Minyi's world. He stood in the center of the small fixer-upper, his forearms dusted with white drywall powder and his palms calloused in a way that felt like an achievement. It wasn't the Grand Imperial, and it certainly wasn't a penthouse, but every nail driven into the floorboards was his. He had spent the last 4 months working as a project consultant for a mid-sized firm, one his mother had no influence over. The pay was a fraction of what he once managed, but when the direct deposit hit his account every 2 weeks, He didn't feel like a thief in his own life. He felt like a man earning his air. A light knock at the propped-open front door made him look up. Aaliyah stood there, a cardboard carrier of coffee in one hand and a roll of blueprints in the other. She didn't rush in. She waited for him to beckon her, respecting the boundaries they had painstakingly laid down over dozens of difficult, honest dinners. "Progress?" she asked, her eyes scanning the new framing of the kitchen. "The subfloor is finally level," Minyi said, wiping his hands on a rag. He took the coffee from her, his fingers brushing hers. The touch didn't send him into a spiral of desperation anymore. It felt like a grounding wire. "I thought I'd be further along, but doing it right takes a lot longer than doing it fast." Aaliyah smiled, a real, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. "Doing it right is the only way it stays standing, Minyi." They sat on a pair of plastic-covered crates, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows they had spent the previous weekend scrubbing clean. For months, their rebuilding hadn't been about grand gestures or expensive jewelry. It had been about the quiet, mundane work of consistency. It was Minyi calling her just to say he was safe. It was him showing her his bank statements not out of obligation, but for transparency. It was the way he had finally stopped mentioning his mother's name as if it were a curse or a prayer. "I saw her last week," Minyi said suddenly, his voice steady. "At a charity gala I was supposed to be honoring. I stayed for 10 minutes to drop off my resignation from the board and then I left. I didn't even stay for the toast." Aaliyah watched him closely. "How did it feel?" "Like looking at a stranger," he admitted. "The power she had. It was only because I let her hold the remote. Without the money and the fear, she's just a lonely woman in a very large hotel room." He reached out and took Aaliyah's hand, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. "I used to think I needed to be a king to deserve you. I was so busy trying to build a throne that I didn't realize I was trampling the garden we were supposed to be tending." "I never wanted a king," Aaliyah whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. The smell of cedar and sweat was better than any expensive cologne. "I just wanted someone who would stand in the garden with me." The house was still a work in progress. The walls were bare, the plumbing was temperamental, and the future was unwritten. But as the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the raw wood, Minyi knew they weren't afterthoughts anymore. They were the architects. He didn't know if the trust would ever be as seamless as it once was, but as he looked at the woman beside him, he realized that a repaired heart, much like a repaired house, was often stronger at the joints than the original ever could have been. They had cut the cord, and in the silence that followed, they had finally found their own voices. The soft, rhythmic puff of Nari's breath was the only sound in the nursery, a fragile counterpoint to the storm brewing in the hallway. Aaliyah sat in the rocking chair, her gaze fixed on the tiny tuft of dark hair peeking out from the swaddle. Nari was only 3 weeks old, a miracle of soft skin and fierce lungs, and she represented a world that was entirely untainted by the venom of the past. When the doorbell rang, Aaliyah didn't startle. She had seen the black sedan pull up on the security monitor minutes ago. She waited until she heard Minyi's low, guarded voice at the door, followed by a sharper, more desperate tone she hadn't heard in over a year. Minyi entered the nursery first, his face a mask of conflict. Behind him stood the woman who had once tried to dismantle their lives. But the mother-in-law who stepped over the threshold was not the grandmaster of the Grand Imperial. Her designer suit looked a size too large, and the imperious tilt of her chin had been replaced by a tentative, almost fragile searching. She stopped 3 feet from the crib, her eyes landing on the sleeping infant. "She looks like you, Minyi," the older woman whispered, her voice cracking. "She has your father's brow." "She has her own name," Aaliyah said, her voice quiet but vibrating with a strength that stopped the air in the room. She didn't stand up. She stayed in the chair, the physical embodiment of the gatekeeper she had become. "Her name is Nari, and she is not a legacy, and she is not a pawn." The mother-in-law turned to Aaliyah, her eyes brimming with a calculated moisture that quickly turned into genuine desperation when she saw the lack of pity in Aaliyah's expression. "I've spent months in that hotel, Aaliyah. Every day I wait for a phone call that never comes. I have everything and I have absolutely nothing. Please, I just want to be a grandmother. I want to help." Aaliyah looked at Minyi. He remained silent, his hand resting on the back of Aaliyah's chair, a silent declaration of where his loyalty lived. "Help is not what we need," Aaliyah said, standing up slowly and shifting Nari to her shoulder. "What we need is respect. You spent years treating people like assets to be managed or discarded. If you want a role in this child's life, the terms have changed. You are not the head of this family. You are a guest." The older woman opened her mouth to protest, a flicker of the old fire sparking in her eyes, but it died out just as quickly. She looked at her son, who didn't look away, and then at the daughter-in-law she had tried to erase. "There will be no family trust talk," Aaliyah continued, her tone clinical and firm. "There will be no comments on how we raise her, how we spend our money, or where we live. You will enter this house only when invited. You will apologize to Minyi for the sabotage, and you will apologize to me for the lies. And if you ever, even once, attempt to manipulate Nari the way you manipulated her father, you will never see her again. Is that clear?" The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of decades of pride. For a long moment, it seemed the older woman might walk out, choosing her ego over the child in the room. But then her shoulders slumped. She looked at Nari's small, curled hand and nodded, a single, jagged movement. "I understand," she whispered. "Good," Aaliyah said. "She didn't offer the baby for her to hold. That would take time, perhaps years of proven consistency. Minyi will show you out. We'll call you when we're ready for a visit." As the door clicked shut behind them, Aaliyah sat back down, the scent of cedar and baby powder enveloping her. The cord hadn't just been cut. It had been replaced by a new standard. She looked down at Nari, who shifted in her sleep, blissfully unaware that her mother had just finished winning a war she would never have to fight.